I was going to start and set the context for my panellists to please join me. So come on up, because I think there's something very interesting while we're talking about transforming cities at this panel, there is something important to acknowledge about that symbiotic relationship of region and city. But I want to start by firstly introducing myself, Malcolm Smith. I'm the Australasian Cities Leader for Arup, based in Melbourne. And I'm joined this afternoon by three incredibly kind of rich understandings and different perspectives on the way in which we can look at cities. We have at the far end, Monica Barone, CEO, City of Sydney. Monica, welcome. Adrian, Collette, CEO, Creative Australia. Adrian, welcome.
Thank you.
And Eliza, Owen, Head of Research, CoreLogic.
Yes.
Let me just set the context. I was going to start this kind of transforming cities in a different way, and then I think what some of the things that the senators just shared with it produces a different point of entry. There's a very interesting piece of work done by Professor Michael Parkinson, John Moore University in the UK. This is when they were beginning to look at the future of the cities. And he studied, many conclusions came of that. You know, there was kind of the Blair government and the relationship with the renaissance of the cities. But the core conclusion he had, there was a symbiotic relationship between region and city. A successful city is a successful region, and a successful region is a successful city. So while we'll focus today on the city, I think it's important to acknowledge that it sits in that symbiotic context. The second thing I want us to remember is, you know, most of the cities of the future already exist now. Bridget was talking about kind of the growth on the edges of our cities, but the substantial infrastructure or the place or the land take already exists. So remember that. But we wanted to set this context. It feels like the pandemic was a long time ago, though, you know, being able to fly around was only a year ago. But I think the role of the pandemic reminds us of one thing that I want us to think about. The way in which we have these punctuations, the way in which the city changes. Sometimes those punctuations are, as we heard earlier, an Olympic Games, you know, my home city of Brisbane. Sometimes they can be short-term, you know, an extreme weather event, you know, other events. Very occasionally, these events are big and wide and long, and that is the pandemic. Most of the events that kind of punctuate our cities, we'll hear about some of those, are short and narrow. Some are wide and long. And look at the way in which we had to respond. Speed, new ways of understanding economic relationships, the economy performing, the way in which we mapped and understood those changes. So let's take that as a clue of we've got these systems of disruption or enjoyment that affect the places we make. So one observation maybe for each of our panellists that set the context of transforming the cities. I was doing some work with a big digital company, and they said, Malcolm, you know, the opportunity or the chance that the pandemic hit at the same time that we had the digital capacity to talk to each other should not be underestimated. 5 years earlier, we would not have had, you know, Teams and talking to each other. I know we all love those late night meetings of, you know, doing that stuff. We wouldn't have had that. There was a symbiotic point that happened. And it's the role of, and that allows us to see things, the data of the way in which we performed, the monitoring of how many toilet rolls everyone was buying. But importantly, today, we're able to take some of that data and begin to analyse it. You know, I think Eliza's going to talk to us a little bit about what does it mean into the future, and when we have things like AI that are extrapolating this data into a new way. Monica kind of brings this view of policy in the context. And so I wanted to kind of explore what that could really mean. We've heard a little bit about agility and response. Lucky enough to do some work with the City of Amsterdam where they trialled a planning process where they had multiple uses for new buildings. Not one use, 3 uses. You get approval if you can demonstrate this. I think, Monica, you've got some very interesting observations about what can that economically work with asset owners. And finally, Adrian, the role of the creative industries. It was interesting, I was listening to Sally Noonan, Chief Exec, Melbourne Theatre Company, just the other day. Sally made a really beautiful point reminded us that creative industries can often have this insight of looking over the horizon, giving us a little bit of a mirror of what we're thinking, what we're feeling. And I wonder whether the creative industries have that type of role to play into the future. So look, there's a little bit of context. I'll remind you, you can send the questions. I do have the iPad, terrified by reading questions live. And then we will send the mic around a little bit more. But look, Eliza, I wanted to start in that place of data. What are these trends that we think we're kind of see, particularly in housing? Because, that is an existential issue for us all at the moment. What are these preferences that are coming? What are the markets saying? And how can we start using that to inform the decisions of transforming a city? So some thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and scene setting as well. I guess from the urban perspective and looking at Sydney over time, maybe there's not so much positive news to start off with. I think about trends in tenure, for example. Renting has become an increasing part for households across Sydney. That's not necessarily a thing of housing preference, but of affordability challenges. I also see, there's nationally speaking a pretty slow take-up of higher density and apartments. If you look at ABS housing and occupancy data, they show that first home buyers in 2019-20, so just pre-pandemic, around 16.5% had purchased units as a first home. And that's only come up from 13% in a 10-year period. So that's been a slow burn. I think now that we're post-pandemic and there was, in terms of market pricing, a real preference for houses, the difference between the median house and unit in Greater Sydney has blown out from $250,000 in March 2020 to about $580,000. So once again, we're looking at not an issue of housing preference, but no choice for first home buyers who don't have help to get into a detached house. And from that perspective, I think there's a kind of topsy-turviness of the city in that if we look at New South Wales over time, the portion of two-bedroom family households that were in a detached house of 4 or more bedrooms was about 23% in 2011. So of your two-family households, 23% in a detached house of 4 or more bedrooms. That's increased to 29% in 2021. And I don't want to lay this all on the boomers, right? This is probably an element of people buying larger homes where they can to work from home or have their home office or gym or whatever. But I'm sure we all know those empty nesters who are living in homes that are larger than really what they absolutely need. They might love it, but it's probably larger than what they absolutely need versus the young families that would absolutely be clawing to get into something like that. So I guess that's some of the worrying trend that I've seen over time. In terms of the broad landscape, I think there have been some maybe more positive developments. And it's something that actually in our pre-panel discussion, you sort of raised, Monica, about the nature of finance as well. We've seen a composition change in housing finance across New South Wales, where long-term it's always been a larger market for investors. About 40% of housing finance historically in New South Wales goes to fund investment properties. That peaked back in 2015. It was 55% of the mortgage market was going for purchase of investment properties in May of 2015. And we saw various macroprudential interventions come in, which kind of took investors out of the market a bit over time. So they weren't to necessarily better the housing market, they were to kind of create more stability and mitigate any potential risk of speculation in the mortgage market over time. But what it did do was create a little more room for owner-occupiers and first home buyers and things like that. So, you know, and we got some great things out of that investment boom. We got really cheap rent, for example, but we also got things like Opal Towers. So I think, you know, there's been some examples of very good developments across Sydney over time, but some positive that we've seen in the change. But some things that we really need to address as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we were talking earlier about the importance of the measurability of things, and you highlight that capacity that comes when we begin to understand the relationships and the nuances. It'll be interesting to talk later on how do you extrapolate out of that. But I do want to kind of, Monica, bring you in. You know, the City of Sydney, Sustainable Sydney 2050. What an incredible kind of policy and foresight document. But do you think how are we kind of adapting our planning strategies to allow those type of insights to come in to give us this resilience, this speed of impact that we spoke about earlier, the long and the short? Thoughts on that I think you see inside the 2050 document?
So I'm going to say a few words about infrastructure and the infrastructure you need for cities and the systems that you need in order for cities to thrive or to even function. When I induct new staff to the City of Sydney, one of the things I always say is you've got to remember that people don't live in silos, they live in places. You don't get up on Monday morning and say, today I'm going to work, and tomorrow I'm going to school, and on Wednesday I'm going to go to the doctor, Thursday I'm shopping, and Friday I'm going to go to the theatre. You get up in the morning, and the minute you step out the door, you engage with the public transport system, which is called the footpath, which is the first, part of the public transport system, and you pack your children off to childcare or school, and then you go off to work, and then maybe at lunchtime you go to the doctor, and then you might do a bit of shopping in the evening. You might, do something with your children, and then on Friday night you might actually make it to the theatre. The way that all of those things come together is what we refer to as urban policy, right? And when it's the way that those things work together that actually leads to things like productivity, to our health, to our connectivity, and to our inclusion. If you build and then manage a city well, then you get great benefits out of that. But if you don't, then you detract from those really important attributes. And it is actually possible to map and measure all of those attributes. You talk about how do you build a city that is resilient and adaptable. I'll just use the example of Green Square, which is an urban renewal site that the City of Sydney was responsible for. About 65,000 people, 25,000 jobs. The City of Sydney alone, one local government, has put $2.3 billion worth of infrastructure to enable an urban renewal site that actually has nearly all of the attributes that modern urban renewal sites should have. And that doesn't count what the state has put in, things like the heavy rail. The absolute not negotiables in any urban renewal today, if we're going to build cities that are resilient and adaptable, are active transport built in from the beginning. It has to be walkable, you have to be able to ride a bike, and you have to have public transport. You have to have canopy. You have to have lots of room for trees and lots of green space. You have to have recycled water. You have to have jobs, commerce near where people live and live. You have to have community infrastructure. You have to have affordable housing, and you have to have an understanding and an expression of culture, what came before, in New South Wales referred to as connecting with country, the identity of the people today, and of course how they see themselves in the future. You have to have all of that to build a resilient place. We managed to get all of that into Green Square, except to get some decentralised energy that would ensure that in an energy failure, there would be enough locally generated energy to keep the place going. We do have the recycled water. All of those things should just be a matter of policy. They should not be something we have to argue every time we develop, because what we do is we go back to square one and we revisit all of those things every time we develop, and we argue for every one of those attributes. So what I'm saying is, if you have good urban policy which understands how it all comes together and how you get multiple productivity and livability from a place, and you build into the infrastructure all of those things that I described, including lots of affordable housing, and affordable I mean rent-controlled community housing held in perpetuity by community housing providers, then you've got a chance of building a resilient and adaptable city.
Monica, very powerful to hear about the multiple systems that go to transforming a city. It reminded me of some research that was done, once again in the UK. Excuse me, I spent a little bit of time over there. One of the new towns in Cambridgeshire, and they built the housing, and that was it. There was a 10-year lag between the core infrastructure arriving, the social, some of the physical, the connectivity. The psychological impacts on that community and the cost therefore was disproportionate to the investment of, I think we need a new term called preemptive infrastructure. We did a study, we talked about the high-speed rail system earlier. We did a study on the high-speed rail systems of Europe. If you preempted the supporting infrastructure or you waited for the rail system to turn up, there was about a 15% GDP change. You had a lag of about 25 years. And so this preemptive infrastructure in transforming cities. But Adrian, look, that role of looking over the horizon at culture and allowing that to kind of talk to us. I know there's some, the new cultural policy revive that's coming through and the strong pillar of culture infrastructure. How can the creative industries participate in this kind of curating and evolving our city environments?
I love the idea of preemptive infrastructure, which is probably a cue. I think the short answer is just by working much more closely together. We're quite new to the party here. It's great to be in this room. I was just looking at that and saying, CEO of Creative Australia, that's quite a big idea, really. I don't think it's quite dawned on me until I saw the sign. But I just want to back up for a minute and explain why I'm here, because I think it will answer your question or get close to it. About 9 months ago, the organisation I now head up was called the Australia Council for the Arts. And a terrific organisation, which is the federal government's investment and advocacy body for the arts, for organisations like the NTC and lots of great individual artists, and Australia's creative talent is quite extraordinary. That change of name went with a national cultural policy, not an arts policy, a cultural policy, which is a whole of government policy. And the case we began to make was that an investment in artistic skills and talent, which can be very controversial or can be whatever, is an investment in a much bigger idea and a much bigger reality. And I've been very pleasantly surprised by how quickly that idea, the idea of a creative industry, really for the first time, is starting to be developed and acted on in this country. So that's where we get our foundation. That's why I'm so delighted to be at an infrastructure conference. And if I can be just cute for a minute, our mission is creativity connects us. It is essentially a public value or a public good mission. It has arts and creativity at its core, but creativity connects us culturally, socially, and we are absolutely in sympathy with the economic arguments. The cute bit is infrastructure, roads, bridges, transport, they connect us. They absolutely connect us. And for the first time, we are seeing policy settings, most notably from Infrastructure Australia, that says what I think the CEO of Regional Institute Australia said this morning: you cannot talk about infrastructure, hard infrastructure these days, without talking about social infrastructure. So that's, I think, where we come into the picture and where these things start to collide. It's not about arts, it's about creative infrastructure.
Yeah.
And our view really is what people in this room do, the infrastructure provided to community and to cities, is part of that creative economy. It's not supporting artists, it is absolutely part of the creative economy. And I think the conversation is just starting to get sophisticated enough for policy development work around that.
Adrian, it's an incredibly important kind of relationship that you form there between the hard and the soft infrastructure. You know, I've just gone through a process, not in Australia, of trying to connect hard infrastructure to the way in which a city transforms its carbon, its cultural context inside a business case. And it's nice to see some of the Infrastructure Australia guidelines starting to connect the hard business cases that we used to have of how many people and how much of this with some of the systems that you've spoken about, Monica, that you've spoken about inside our business cases. Are we sharp enough on that? I don't think so. We're not going to transform if we can't connect these parameters together. Look, just reminding you, there's a few questions coming in, so don't hesitate. The person who said, Malcolm, would that be Camborne? You're absolutely right. I think I saw you smile. So Camborne is the town in the United Kingdom. Go and have a look what not to do. There's a question that a few people have kind of brought forward, and I'll leave it. Maybe, Monica, start with you. If we added a dozen high-density TOD sites, transport-orientated development sites around Sydney and surrounds, how would that transform our city?
Well, I think the intention of the TOD sites, of course, is to increase density around the city because we have a housing supply issue. And I think largely people understand that and understand that it needs to be done. I think it just really comes back to what I said earlier. You know, you can't cram a whole lot of people in unless you're prepared to provide the infrastructure that they need. And it's all of the infrastructure, from the hard infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure. So I think, you know, but I think the license to get the community license to support that, though, does come with the delivery of the infrastructure. I mean, at the Green Square, we delivered most of the social infrastructure before we actually delivered most of the housing. And so people could see what it is that they were going to get.
Eliza, I thought it had a kind of resonance with what you were talking about earlier. As you were talking, we were talking about, you know, suburban housing, we're talking about apartments, two types. Do you think, and we talk about TODs as kind of intensifying and transforming cities around transport, do you think we're missing a few typologies of, you know, we have family structures, we live differently, we, you know, age, all of those things. Do you think we're short in what you're measuring in terms of the types beyond just TODs and suburban conditions?
Yeah, I think that we desperately, like, density is like screaming as the answer, and transport-orientated development is incredibly important. What's really cool is that there is already some of the data and technology out there to help us fast-track developments and speed up the planning process. We work with a company called Archistar, and they actually have generative AI models where you input the local planning codes, and it can literally spit out a model of what a higher density hub looks like around these transport developments. I think the issue is enablement, both in the sense that it can be difficult, you know, with the layers of government to get community embracing higher density in certain areas, even though I feel like there are areas that would benefit so much from it. I asked my dad, who's in Castle Hill, I said, you know, where do you want to retire? Do you want to go to the mountains? Do you want to go to the coast? You could probably do both. You've got all this equity in your property. And he said, oh, Castle Hill. You know, so having the higher density there available for my parents when they're ready to downsize, I think is really important and something that would benefit a lot of outer suburban areas of Sydney as well. But, you know, there's also obviously the short-term challenge in the construction sector where costs have increased massively. We've got labour market shortages. Migration is kind of tied into that, which has been talked about today as well.
It's interesting you give your dad is kind of where I'd like to retire. You know, we talk about social license, about kind of change, but the social capital that people invest in places. You know, one of the things that when people ask me, you know, what characterises a good place, it's the willingness to kind of stay with that capital that you invest, that social capital, the memories of place and the way in which you build it up. And Adrian, it kind of relates a little bit to what a nice question that's come in here. How do we generate community confidence in our ability to transform cities without bipartisan support of the most significant city-shaping investments? And I wondered, as you were talking, does the role of a cultural infrastructure occupy the bipartisan territory? And is that the beginning of one way that we can have this kind of neutralised, or maybe not neutralised, space to operate inside of? A thought.
For me, that really does go into the kind of community buy-in. So if you're talking about TODs as well, I think you could call it preemptive infrastructure. But the kind of public good I'm thinking about, the kind of value created, is to anticipate, as Monica has been saying, the kind of cultural infrastructure that would be impactful in place. We are where we live, you know.
Yeah.
These things are not divorced. So as you think about the hard infrastructure that has to be created to bring people together, I'm saying a very obvious thing, and thank goodness Infrastructure Australia is saying it. You have to think about the social and creative infrastructure that binds communities. Creativity connects us because the urgency of this in policy making, and governments of any stripe will say this, and perhaps given current public discourse about many issues, the urgency is more apparent than ever. We live in one of the most culturally diverse countries on earth. It is one of the great things about this country. But in terms of social and public policy making and infrastructure development, that should never, ever go off the agenda. I can give you one example that really struck me. Early on in this role, I was invited to the Casula Powerhouse in Liverpool, probably the second most, I think I know this as a fact, diverse population out of Sydney. Disused powerhouse was an important bit of kit. Nothing was being done with it. They transformed this into a creative centre. And I don't mean an art centre. I mean where people can start exhibiting their artistic work and performing. But the magic started to happen, which is you got creative and cultural exchange.
Yeah.
You know, and that happened because it was someone's bright idea. I think what we're seeing, and encouragingly increasingly, is these sorts of things are starting to be thought about in terms of the infrastructure that we self-evidently have to provide, given the way our population is going.
And the power station example kind of triggers in my mind the role of these new economic ecosystems that often build, you know, around sectors such as the creative industries.
Just heard about the circular economy, didn't we?
Well, there we go. You know, and that diversity. You know, maybe future infrastructure discussions need to have the cultural, you know, component in a kind of greater emphasis. Monica, I saw you kind of hand up down there in thought.
Well, I did put my hand up because I think if we're really going to have a serious conversation about the future and resilience of our cities, we have to actually be really honest about what's going on. I brought along this plan. I'm going to say how wonderful I think it is. It's the State Disaster Mitigation Plan, and if you haven't read it, I suggest you read it, because the reality is that we are talking about, you know, we're going into a future where large parts of the city that we are talking about densifying or adding people to is going to be underwater. We are talking about, you know, temperatures that are going to be very hard to live in, that are going to, you know, mean that things like our railway lines and others are going to buckle. We are talking about a whole lot of things that are coming down the pipeline. And really, if we really want to talk about the future of our cities, we have to be talking about adaptation, and we have to be talking about the kind of economy we will have to have and move towards to be able to continue to be prosperous in those circumstances. And so I'm just going to say a few words about that. When I read this plan, and I read every single word, it's absolutely magnificent. It really works I chair Resilience Sydney. So Resilience Sydney is all the 33 councils of Greater Sydney, and I've been chairing that for about 5 years, and we've got a Resilience Sydney plan. Finally, we have a plan from the state government that is going to enable us to realise and actually do something about the things that we've uncovered through that Resilience Sydney work. There's so much in here, but I'll just give you, I'm so excited about this plan that I can actually quote you pages. One of my favourite actions is, or lines in it is, we do not have a plan that brings land use and transport together to deal with the issue of evacuation. The floods we just had cut off a community in the Hawkesbury-Nepean area now, right? So how can we keep talking about increases to population, increases to density and all that sort of thing when we haven't actually addressed all of those sorts of things? And please don't get me wrong and don't walk out of this room saying, oh, the City of Sydney doesn't want to build more housing, because the City of Sydney has built more housing probably than anybody through our approvals and through our affordable housing programs and all the rest of it. It is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you're going to do it, you have to actually address those things. That can be a really basic infrastructure story. When it rains in the city, you probably all see this. The rain floods the streets. The manholes flood. Why is that? Because the stormwater pipes under the ground weren't built for the kind of rainfall we now have. You cannot, the cost to retrofit just the stormwater pipes is out of everyone's reach. The more hard surface and the more built environment you put, the less absorption there will be and the more flooding there will be. These are the underlying infrastructure discussions that we have to have before we can increase the size of the city, the scale of the city. So that's one example of many examples of infrastructure adaptation work that we need to do if this city is going to be as prosperous for our children as it is now. But I'm just going to, my last comment, but then as a consequence of that, we have to be really creative in the way we think about the future of the economy. Now, this is a really clumsy way to put it, but what I've been saying in all of the meetings that I go to where we talk about the economy is, isn't it time, and I know lots of people are talking about this and thinking about this, we have to really move to the high-value, low-volume economy. The high-value jobs, right? We have to move to the parts of the economy that can generate the most with the least number of people. So we've got to really put all of these things together, just like in my opening remarks. You have to put all of the types of infrastructure together, but you have to put all of the systems and drivers of a city together and say, how do you work those things to get the kinds of results that we need to actually have a resilient city? So I'm saying it's adaptation, we have to turn our mind to it, and it's a really big rethink around the economy.
Monica, it feels like you highlight the fact that there's someone missing in this panel. As you were talking, it reminded me of the work that we've been doing called the Resilience Shift, and that's with Lloyd's Insurance. You know, you can have these discussions about trees and canopies and all of that, but the ability for our economic structures of insurance to support is beginning to drive some of those things, the way in which we cannot begin to kind of assess risk in the same way. Look, I'm just watching the time and we're cracking through. If there is anyone in the audience that wants to kind of throw a hand up and we can get a microphone to you. It's Friday afternoon, everyone's very comfortable. I know, I see it there. That's absolutely fine. There's a few other questions that are coming in. But Eliza, I want to take you back. I think I gave you fair warning. You gave us an incredible introduction on the statistics of different housing systems, but we're now using data in a different way where we're extrapolating it. We heard a colleague from John Holland talk about AI systems. Is that coming into the thinking of the way in which you and CoreLogic are kind of thinking about the data that we get?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're a big data company, right? So that's a core part of how we contribute to the housing discussion. I mentioned already Gen AI that's used in kind of modelling to increase density. We, again, partnered with Archistar in a granny flat report that was identifying at the individual lot level, the slope of the land, the size as to whether you could put a granny flat on it. I'm not necessarily saying that's the road to density in Sydney, but we did identify 240,000 properties that you could put a granny flat on, which is substantial when you consider that New South Wales has got this target of around 75,000 dwellings to be completed a year. There's also aspects of sustainability and environmentalism that we're looking at. So we've partnered with CSIRO to estimate a energy efficiency star rating for established dwellings, which is a big black box in the housing market that's missing. And it also feeds into how we incentivise and price things like home loans, how we distribute, government concessions based on whether people are committed to increasing the energy efficiency of their home. On the insurance space, we do bushfire attack level ratings through AI, and we do after natural disasters, an assessment of the properties that have been damaged, so we can alert the banks and insurance companies of that as well. So, yeah, I think that it's interesting. I feel like the private sector there's so much there. We're ready and raring to go, but due to the economics of the day as well, which include the constraint on more development at the moment, from housing to infrastructure, transport, and all sorts of different construction projects, we're just a bit limited at the moment.
Yeah, no, it's the way in which we're going to be able to kind of use this information, I think, to scenario test increasingly. I found it very interesting sitting over there in London during the pandemic, watching the French use their TGVs as hospitals. Did you know that? They changed the trains to hospitals. I wonder whether that was in the plan for the TGVs. Look, Adrian, there's an interesting question here that kind of builds on Eliza's thing about getting into some practical examples. Question here, where in the world do they connect creativity, social infrastructure and hard infrastructure well? Any examples that come to mind? I've got one or two, but, your thoughts.
Cool Britannia.
Where?
Cool Britannia is a big idea.
Cool Britannia, yeah.
They've taken a precinct approach, as we're doing here, but clearly now a lot of their infrastructural thinking about regions is start with the cultural infrastructure, because if you don't, communities aren't going to accept all these things that we have to do, So that's a big idea. Certainly creative economy and creative thinking in the Scandinavian countries, as we heard earlier, is much more mature than it is here. The reflex is, if you're providing infrastructure and connecting people, respect the absolute principle of human connection that you have to provide for and exchange.
Yeah, no, and as you were talking, having lived through Cool Britannia a little bit, also going to our Dutch friends, the way in which the Dutch have used the creative industries inside the fabrics of the cities, both the central and the non-central areas of the cities, I think, is a real example. Monica, we were going to talk a little bit about the kind of some of the practicalities of the way in which, how do we kind of get projects to be resilient in this new economic context, that you've championed? How do we?
Well, I'll give that a go, and I'll actually stick with the cultural version.
Please.
So, because I go back so far that I was part of a group of people that were advocating for the census to actually count creative industries. And then the City of Sydney, of course, does a 100% floor space census every year of the entire city. And it's one of the most sophisticated data sets that you will get about what's going on in the city. And one of the things that we measure is creative industries. And as a consequence of that, we know how many thousands of square metres of creative space we have lost. Because, of course, the warehouses that students and artists occupy become new apartments. Through gentrification, artists are pushed out. So we have in our 2050 vision a target to try to recover that floor space. There isn't a benchmark that I know of that says this is how many square metres of floor space a innovative and successful and resilient city has, but at least we know how much we've got and how much we want to maintain and grow. So we've done a number of things to address that issue of floor space. We've either used voluntary planning agreements, so through the voluntary planning agreement, we now have the Bathurst Art Studio, which is about 2,000 square metres of art space. Have you seen that? I should take you if you haven't. So it's a fabulous space right in the middle of the CBD. The rehearsal space is big enough that you can map almost any stage in Sydney on it, whether it's the Opera House or Sydney Theatre Company. You can map your size of stage on it and you can rehearse so you're not using your theatre. It's got music studios, recording studios, wet studios and all the rest of it. We've done planning controls on Oxford Street now and Botany Road, where basically there are planning incentives. You can get extra height, but in return you have to return so much creative floor space, which can then be leased out to artists and other things. So these are the ways you have to use every lever. But before you do that, you have to know that these attributes, as I started my comments on, that these attributes matter. You have to know that it matters that you have artists and creative people. And of course, you cannot talk about an innovation economy unless you have artists and creative people, because they're part of that spectrum. So you have to know that that matters. And you have to know that green space matters and how much you need for everybody. And you have to know that childcare matters. You have to know that all these things matter. And then you have to try and, as your city grows and changes, ensure that those things are designed in and funded. And you need to use every lever possible. So, of course, in a city context, development is a key lever. Everyone wants a few extra floors, fine. You want something, we want something. We represent the public interest. The public interest is those attributes. You want a bit more floor space, we need another childcare centre.
Monica, what matters is that we've run out of time, which is...
just warming up on a Friday afternoon.
If you promise 10 seconds each, just one idea to leave with the audience today from your fields. We'll start, Eliza, with you, and we'll give Monica a second. Very quickly.
Yeah, I think we have the answers in front of us around creating more density within Sydney and creating the foundations that can hold that density as well. I think we're in a challenging economic time with a temporary spike in population and slowly, painfully unwinding constraints in the construction sector. But we can look forward to some of those things normalising in the next few years, which will help the delivery of that.
Terrific. Adrian,
this is very specific. I want community music hubs. It's there in the national cultural policy. We want to co-invest in it. And it goes to your point about space. I have never seen a sector, an industry more challenged than the contemporary music business at the moment. My experience of it is now nostalgic. It needs places, and you get extraordinary dividends from it.
Well, Monica?
My closing remarks are, at the moment, the things that really keeps me awake at night is looking over all of the sectors that the City of Sydney, not our inner city. Remember, inner city Sydney is 23% of the state's economy, 7% of the nation's economy, right? Every sector that we rely on, except maybe financial services, has a really big glaring vulnerability. I'm not going to go into the details, but it has a great big glaring vulnerability, and we need to work on dealing with that. But my positive, what do we need to do? We really, really need to learn to collaborate, and I mean proper collaboration, proper partnership. That's what we need. Could we have a whole conference on it? Because we say the word, but we don't really know what it means.
Well, you would swear you kind of had the cue. I see the smiles from the audience. At the next section, we're going to talk about collaboration. Can I ask everyone to thank the panellists about transforming cities? How do we change it? Thank you, everyone.